Welcome. If you crave chilling true crime stories, real mysteries, and twists you'll never see coming, you're in the right place. Subscribe now and join a community that never looks away from the truth. Because every week, we shine a light where others won't. Are you ready? Let's begin. They called it an ordinary Tuesday until it wasn't. The town of Meridian Hollow, population just over 12,000, prided itself on being the kind of place where nothing extraordinary ever happened. You could set your watch by the way life unfolded there. The delivery trucks pulled up to the bakery at 7 a.m. sharp. The diner opened its doors at 6:30, and by 6:35, the same regulars filled their corner booths. Farmers nursing black coffee, retirees splitting cinnamon rolls, and teenagers huddled in booths they'd long since claimed as their own. By 10 at night, a kind of collective hush fell over town. Porch lights blinked off almost in unison, like a small galaxy dimming. It was a rhythm everyone knew, everyone counted on. That rhythm shattered on a wet Tuesday in late October. Eleanor Ellie Mays had worked late at the municipal records office. Overtime was never something she asked for, but her supervisor, a man who seemed allergic to file organization, had begged her to stay. By the time she pulled into her gravel driveway, rain slicked the pavement and the air smelled like rust and wood smoke. In the back seat of her hatchback sat a week's worth of groceries, sweating under the condensation. Ellie left them there, just for a moment. She wanted to check on her son first. Jonah, 7 years old, all restless limbs and curiosity, freckles splashed across his nose as if someone had flicked paint on him. A boy with more questions than anyone had patience for. Why leaves changed color? Why people lied? Why dogs tilted their heads when you spoke? He was Ellie's center of gravity. Not 5 minutes earlier, a neighbor had seen him in the yard, swinging on the rope swing Ellie's father had tied to the oak tree decades ago. But when she stepped from her car, Ellie saw the gate wide open, the swing rocking gently in the wet night air. Jonah was gone. The first few seconds didn't register as panic. She called his name in that sharp, maternal tone meant to draw a child back from mischief. No answer. She checked the garage, the shed, even behind the woodpile where he sometimes played at being a soldier. Nothing. She scanned the street, half expecting him to pop out from behind the mailbox with a giggle. Silence. The kind of silence that prickled the skin. What makes this story so chilling isn't a sudden van snatching a child from the curb, or a ransom note slipped under the door. It's the ordinariness of the failures that followed. A neighbor assumed Jonah had wandered down to Sam's corner store. The babysitter, who usually arrived by 5, had left early to cover a shift at the bowling alley. A clerk at the police station, weary from double shifts, filed Ellie's missing child report under pending, to be looked at later. Each choice small, each choice human, each one a stitch loosened from the fabric of safety. Meridian Hollow's police force was not built for urgency. They were lean, their days filled more with parking disputes than manhunts. To them, a missing child looked like a runaway teen, a custody dispute, or a kid hiding from bedtime. They moved with the practiced calm of paperwork and procedure. Forms filled, emails stamped, received, reports filed. But for Ellie, every tick of the clock scraped her raw. Her certainty calcified into something hotter, more consuming. Fear that burned so fiercely it pushed her past exhaustion. It's important to understand Ellie Mays. She was no archetype, no fragile mother destined to unravel. She was stubborn in ways her co-workers politely called tenacious. She had grown up in Meridian Hollow, a place where people assumed you kept your head down, but Ellie had never been good at that. She could stare a bureaucrat into backtracking with nothing but her quiet insistence. That quality became a weapon in the days that followed. She made a ledger, a thick notebook where she wrote down Jonah's habits, his favorite spots, the treehouse behind the Parker's yard, the drainage ditch he wasn't supposed to climb into, the path that led down to the abandoned greenhouse on Sycamore Lane. She wrote down every detail as though the sheer act of putting ink on paper could conjure him back. The time he'd learned to whistle, the chipped tooth he refused to smile about, the scar on his left knee. The ledger became less record and more prayer. When the police told her to wait, she pressed harder. When they said they'd canvass tomorrow, she asked why not tonight. She made phone calls, drove herself to the diner to ask if anyone had seen Jonah walk by. She demanded the surveillance footage from the corner store and noticed it had been logged but not reviewed. She asked why the patrol car circling her neighborhood had its dashboard camera off during the very hour Jonah vanished. At first, her questions sounded like polite probes into procedure. Later, they hardened into accusations. But before the fire in her chest could ignite fully, there was that first night. The night when Jonah was simply missing, and the town of Meridian Hollow hadn't yet grasped the weight of what was coming. The house felt cavernous without Jonah's voice. Ellie left the porch light on, as though it could beckon him back, and sat at the kitchen table with her untouched groceries still sweating in their bags. Each sound outside made her start: the groan of the wind, a car door slamming blocks away, a stray dog barking. She dialed numbers until her phone battery nearly died. Jonah's schoolteacher, his classmates' parents, even the bus driver. Nobody had seen him. The police arrived hours later. 2 officers, rain dripping from their hats, clipboards in hand. They asked routine questions. What was Jonah wearing? When was the last time she saw him? Did he have reason to run away? Ellie wanted to scream at the absurdity. Jonah was 7. He barely crossed the street without holding her hand. She described his sneakers, his red hoodie with a stain on the sleeve, the way he walked slightly pigeon-toed. The officers nodded, jotting notes, but she saw it. The look that said, "We'll wait and see." The search that night was perfunctory. A patrol car drove slowly around the block, shining a spotlight into ditches and yards. A few neighbors stepped outside with flashlights, calling Jonah's name into the wet dark. By midnight, most had gone back inside. The rain fell harder. Ellie stood in the yard until her clothes clung to her skin, whispering Jonah's name like a mantra. By morning, Ellie's ledger had grown frantic. She wrote down every inconsistency she noticed. Why had the neighbor across the street sworn he saw Jonah at 6:05, but the babysitter said she left at 5:45? Why did the corner store clerk remember a boy buying candy, but couldn't recall if it was Jonah or one of the Parker twins? Why did Officer Tillman assure her that kids come back, in a tone so dismissive it felt like a dismissal of Jonah's very existence? The ledger was order in the face of chaos, a shield against despair. She taped photographs of Jonah to its pages, circled maps, listed everyone he knew. Sleep-deprived, her handwriting grew sharp, almost angry. And somewhere between the inked pages and the silence of her empty home, Ellie began to understand something chilling. If she didn't ask the right questions, no one else would. Meridian Hollow was a town that prized its calm above all else. News of Jonah's disappearance spread, but it was spoken of in cautious whispers. The diner regulars shook their heads, offering theories that Jonah had wandered off or that Ellie was exaggerating. A few parents kept their kids closer, but most trusted the police when they said things would settle soon. The mayor gave a brief statement about mobilizing resources, though Ellie knew that meant little more than more paperwork. The school counselor organized a circle time where Jonah's classmates shared their hopes for his safe return, and for a moment, it seemed the town cared. But caring and acting were 2 very different things. For Ellie, the contrast was unbearable. She saw the world frozen in routine, coffee cups clinking, church bells chiming, the postman whistling as though nothing had changed. And against that backdrop, her world had collapsed. This, reader, is where the story begins to split. One version belongs to the town, the calm, procedural, nothing to see here narrative. The other belongs to Ellie, a mother who refused to sit quietly while her son's absence was shuffled into the later pile. Her questions grew sharper, her suspicions darker. And if Meridian Hollow thought it could simply return to its routines, it hadn't yet reckoned with the fire she carried inside her. The wrong turn had been made. The unraveling had begun. 3 weeks had passed since Jonah disappeared. Time had grown strange for Ellie Mays. Days bled into nights without distinction. Clocks ticked, but felt meaningless. The porch light stayed on, her ledger thickened, and the air in the house had changed. Heavier, colder, as if silence itself had gained weight. So when the police called her down to the station on a gray Friday afternoon, Ellie's heart clenched with something dangerous: hope. A boy had been found near the old train depot on the outskirts of town. A boy who said his name was Jonah. The drive to the station was a blur. Ellie's fingers dug crescents into the steering wheel, her chest swelling with the thought that this might finally be over. She rehearsed how she would hold him, the first words she'd say. "I knew you'd come back. I never stopped looking." And then she saw him. The boy sat on a hard bench outside the interview room. legs swinging just above the floor. His sneakers were worn down, his hoodie too big, his hair longer than when she'd last seen him. He looked up when she entered and smiled. The sound that came from Ellie's throat was half sob, half prayer. She dropped to her knees, arms flung around him. He hugged her back, small and warm, with the right smell of grass and soap. For an instant, the nightmare fractured, and she almost believed she had woken from it. But then he laughed. It was Jonah's laugh, bright, surprised, slightly squeaky on the inhale. Yet something about it rattled her. Maybe it was too practiced, as if he had learned it rather than lived it. She pulled back to study him, searching his freckled face for every remembered landmark. His eyes were the same. His smile was the same. But then she saw it. A thin scar running diagonally across his right palm. A scar she had never seen before. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. The boy looked at his hand as though the question puzzled him. "From the glass. Remember? At Grandma's." Ellie's stomach lurched. Her mother had been dead for 6 years. Jonah had never met her. The police were jubilant. They had their victory story. A child lost, a child found, a mother's tears of gratitude, all wrapped in a neat bow. Reporters gathered outside the station before Ellie and the boy even left the building. Cameras clicked like insects. News vans hummed in the parking lot. By the time they reached home, the street was clogged with media, neighbors, and well-wishers. Balloons floated. Someone tied a yellow ribbon on her mailbox. Ellie forced smiles. She carried the boy inside, closed the curtains, and tried to breathe. But every time she looked at him, the burrs of doubt pressed deeper. There were little things no one else would notice. Jonah had always hated carrots, but this boy devoured them at dinner. Jonah used to flinch and crawl under blankets during thunderstorms, but that first night, when thunder cracked over Meridian Hollow, the boy didn't even blink. Jonah had a stuffed bear named Milo that he never slept without, yet this boy curled into bed without asking for it. Neighbors called it nerves, trauma, adjustment. Ellie nodded, but inside she felt the terror of a woman gaslit by her own relief. On Monday morning, Ellie marched into the police department. She asked for a DNA test. "Mrs. Mays," said Captain Holbrook, the silver-haired officer who'd become the town's face of the search effort, "we've had positive identifications. The boy knows things only Jonah could know. His dental records line up." Ellie pressed her palms on his desk. "Dental records can be faked. Kids can learn things. I need a DNA test." Holbrook's tone hardened. "You need to focus on helping your son recover. He's been through enough. Dragging him through more tests will only confuse him. What he needs is stability. You, of all people, should understand that." The words landed like a slap. "You, of all people." It was an accusation dressed as sympathy. When she insisted again, they offered a compromise: photographs, private sessions with a child welfare official, assessments by a visiting psychologist. No blood work, no swabs, nothing definitive. Ellie wrote her demand formally, in ink, and delivered it by hand. A day later, the police stopped taking her calls. The boy remembered things. Too many things. He remembered Jonah's favorite hiding place in the yard. He remembered the dent in the back of the hatchback, the way the swing creaked when pushed too high. He even remembered the song Ellie used to hum when folding laundry. But there were slips. One afternoon, he insisted her mother had once made apple fritters with him. "The kind with the sugar glaze," he said, smiling fondly. "Your kitchen smelled like them all day." Ellie's chest went cold. Her mother had indeed made apple fritters, but in a house Jonah had never stepped foot in. Another night, she caught him staring too long at family photos on the hallway wall. Not in recognition, but as if memorizing them. The ledger grew again. Ellie scribbled notes late into the night, charting discrepancies, scars, recipes, reflexes, photographs. It was the same ledger she'd begun when Jonah first went missing, but now it read like a cross-examination of an imposter. If Ellie hadn't worked at the municipal records office, she might never have found it. It was a Thursday, her first day back since Jonah's return. She logged into the system to check on her backlog of property filings. Buried in a cluster of police department memos, mislabeled under public safety correspondence, she saw something strange. An internal note from the assistant city manager. It read, "The child identified as Jonah Mays offers closure. Recommend expedited reunification to avoid prolonged headlines. Legal should advise against DNA testing at this stage. Risk of protracted litigation. Public needs resolution, not controversy." Her hands shook so hard she printed 2 copies by accident. She read it over and over, each line cutting deeper. They weren't interested in Jonah. They were interested in appearances, in headlines, in closure. She looked at the boy sleeping in Jonah's bed that night and felt a terror she had never known. If he wasn't Jonah, then who was he? And what had happened to her real son? The more Ellie questioned, the more the walls closed in. The police no longer invited her to press briefings. State troopers began appearing outside her home, not to protect her, but to monitor disturbances. A child welfare officer visited unannounced, carrying a clipboard and a thin smile, asking whether Ellie had considered that her grief was clouding her judgment. At the diner, conversations hushed when she entered. Neighbors who once brought casseroles now looked at her with pitying eyes, whispering that maybe trauma had made her unstable. The boy clung to her more tightly, calling her mom, with such conviction that she sometimes doubted herself. What if she was wrong? What if scars faded, fears changed, and memories twisted under trauma? What if she was destroying the very thing she had begged for? But then she'd catch him staring at her ledger, eyes darting across the notes, lips moving as though practicing lines. By the end of that 3rd week, Ellie understood she wasn't fighting for her son anymore. She was fighting an entire system, one that had decided the truth was less important than the appearance of resolution. The boy in her home might have been a victim, but he was also a shield. A shield the city used to protect itself from scrutiny, from lawsuits, from national shame. He was a substitute, a salvage operation. And if Ellie pushed too hard, she wouldn't just lose Jonah. She'd lose her credibility, her freedom, maybe even her ability to keep asking the questions no one else dared. So she sharpened her ledger into something else. Not just notes, not just prayers, but evidence. And behind closed curtains, as the town of Meridian Hollow celebrated its miracle reunion, Ellie Mays began preparing for war. There are tools that break illusions. Sometimes it's something small, almost laughably ordinary. A ledger smudged with honey from a child's breakfast, a grocery receipt timestamped just so, a mother catching a lullaby sung with the wrong cadence. In Ellie Mays's hands, those tools became weapons. Her ledger had started as a prayer, then a diary, and now it was a compass. Each page filled with frantic ink and circled names, receipts stapled in, sticky notes slapped on margins, arrows pointing between dates and times. When the world around her insisted the narrative was closed, that Jonah was home, safe, case concluded, her ledger told a different story. And Ellie had learned something valuable. Paper trails don't lie. People do. It began with an act of quiet rebellion. Ellie had returned to her job at the municipal records office, moving through the corridors as though she were sleepwalking. Her co-workers, unsure what to say, avoided her gaze. But one afternoon, while she stood by the copier feeding in forms, a voice rasped behind her. "You're not wrong." Ellie turned. It was Mr. Alton, a retired clerk who still lingered around the office, offering advice no one had asked for. His hands trembled from arthritis, his tie forever crooked. "Not wrong about what?" Ellie asked cautiously. He slid a folded sheet of paper toward her. "They archived the log. Thought no one would notice. But I kept a copy." Ellie unfolded it. A security log from the night Jonah disappeared. One column should have held timestamps, the neat minutes of the depot's surveillance feed. Instead, there was a blank, a gap like a missing tooth. And beside it, initials, MS. "Why give this to me?" she asked. Alton's voice dropped. "Because I was told to destroy the original. And I couldn't." His eyes glistened as if confessing a sin. "I don't sleep well anymore." Ellie slid the paper into her ledger, heart pounding. Once she had one thread, others seemed to appear. A paramedic called her late one evening. His voice was hushed, weary. "They told me not to file a supplemental. Said the boy was fine, that it would complicate paperwork. But he wasn't fine. He was disoriented, kept asking the wrong questions. Not about his mom, about a teacher." A dispatcher she cornered in the grocery store admitted she had saved a radio transmission that mysteriously never made it into the case file. "They said the channel glitched," she whispered, glancing down the aisle. "But I still have the recording. I made a copy." And then there was the janitor at the depot. He smoked outside the maintenance shed and spoke as though he'd been waiting for someone to ask. "I saw it. A van. Tinted windows. Parked too long. Nobody ever stays in that lot unless they're waiting for trouble. I told the officers, but they told me not to make it official. Each revelation was like another stitch ripped from the fabric of the official story. Ellie copied them all into the ledger. Notes, initials, times, fragments of overheard testimony. Her kitchen table became a command center, strewn with maps, receipts, printouts, and photographs. She realized the nightmare wasn't about one boy disappearing. It was about a city desperate to keep calm, no matter the cost. The deeper she dug, the clearer the machine revealed itself. At the center was this substitute, the boy presented as Jonah. He wasn't random. He wasn't a stray. He was a hinge, carefully chosen, slotted into place to make the story close neatly. Ellie traced his arrival to the depot. He had been accompanied by a woman with paperwork that placed her in the care system. But when Ellie pressed, those records vanished. Her employment history dissolved overnight, as though she'd never existed. Ellie asked herself, was she a guardian? A handler? A pawn? Around the boy, the machine whirred. A police chief eyeing promotion. A city council drowning in election deadlines. A social services department stretched to breaking, desperate not to trigger investigations that could topple them. Together, they had chosen convenience over truth. As Ellie pressed witnesses, she noticed a pattern. People forgot, or claimed to. The paramedic couldn't recall the exact time of the call. The dispatcher insisted she'd misplaced the transmission. The janitor suddenly remembered less than he had before. And when they didn't forget, they hid behind a word, protocol. It's not my role to release that, one officer told her. Protocol prevents me from discussing ongoing cases, a city lawyer said. It's against protocol to disclose confidential placements. Social services repeated like a mantra. Protocol became their shield, their way of soothing their consciences, as if invoking procedure placed them on the side of good intent, even while the truth twisted out of reach. But Ellie didn't believe in protocol anymore. She believed in Jonah. With the redacted log in her hand, Ellie went to the only person she thought might listen, a local journalist named Daniel Klein. Klein was no crusader. He was a small-town reporter, more used to covering ribbon cuttings than corruption. But when Ellie slid the paper across his desk, he paled. This is evidence of deliberate alteration, he whispered. Then print it, Ellie said. Klein hesitated. If I print this without corroboration, I'll be sued into the ground. Then investigate, Ellie snapped. Talk to the paramedic, the dispatcher, the janitor. They'll tell you what they told me. Klein nodded slowly, but his eyes betrayed fear. He knew what she didn't yet fully grasp. Exposing the truth meant taking on not just the police, but the city itself. When Klein finally published a brief article, Mother questions police timeline in May's case. The reaction was swift and brutal. Officials called it slander. Neighbors muttered that Ellie was unstable, unable to accept her son's miraculous return. But buried within the backlash was something else. An admission no one intended to slip. In a hastily issued press statement, the police spokesperson said, "Our priority has always been the welfare of the child. Decisions were made to protect him from further trauma. Some documentation was necessarily withheld to avoid unnecessary distress." Ellie read it over and over. Decisions were made to protect him. Not Jonah, not your son, just the child. It was the first public crack in the machine's armor. An acknowledgement, however veiled, that choices had been made not for truth, but for convenience. And in that single sentence, Ellie saw what the city had not planned for: human shame. Someone had made a terrible mistake. Someone had decided to offer a substitute child in Jonah's place, believing it was the lesser of two evils. And when the cost of honesty grew too high, they covered it with redactions, protocols, and silence. Ellie understood now. She wasn't just fighting for Jonah. She was fighting an entire narrative designed to erase him. And the deeper she went, the more dangerous that fight would become. The courtroom smelled faintly of floor polish and coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. It wasn't just a room for verdicts anymore. It was a stage, a confessional, and a mirror being held up to Meridian Hollow. The people who filled the wooden benches weren't merely spectators. They were jurors of the town's conscience. Some clutched notebooks, others clasped rosaries, a few scrolled furiously on their phones, live tweeting every exchange as if truth could be captured in a thread of hashtags. Ellie sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded but restless, her ledger beside her like a weapon disguised as a diary. Across from her, The city's attorneys polished their glasses, straightened their ties, and shuffled papers in an endless ballet of composure. They weren't just defending the city. They were defending the illusion that the system still worked. Outside the courthouse, Meridian Hollow had become a battleground of opinions. Lawn signs appeared overnight. We believe Ellie staked proudly beside, trust our institutions. At the diner, arguments broke out over pie and coffee. At the barbershop, haircuts paused mid-snip while men debated whether Ellie was a grieving mother clawing for truth or a woman unraveling under the weight of grief. Social media sharpened the split. Posts with Ellie's tearful photo gathered sympathy and rage, while counterposts painted her as an attention seeker willing to sacrifice a child's fragile healing for her crusade. Hashtags bloomed and clashed. Hashtag Find Jonah versus hashtag Protect the Boy. The boy himself remained strangely absent from the public eye, sheltered by officials, shielded from Ellie except during mandated familiarization visits. In those sterile rooms, with child welfare staff watching, he smiled when told to, but his eyes carried no flicker of recognition for the woman who remembered the smell of his hair after a summer rain. The defense came prepared with its choreography. Ellie wasn't framed as malicious. That would have been too cruel. Instead, she was cast as fragile, unstable, too wrapped in her grief to distinguish reality from paranoia. They spoke of her trauma lens, her compromised judgment. One lawyer in a gray suit adjusted his cufflinks before asking the question that made Ellie's supporters stir in their seats. Mrs. Mays, isn't it true that you've been under significant stress as a single parent? That your work at the records office left you exhausted, sometimes absent-minded? That grief, in cases like yours, can create confusion? Ellie clenched her jaw. She answered quietly, but firmly, grief doesn't rewrite ledgers. It doesn't falsify timestamps. The defense presented affidavits. Police officers swearing the DNA test was not denied, merely delayed for the child's emotional well-being. Officials claimed that evidence logs were misplaced due to clerical error, not malice. They leaned hard on the word protocol, as if it could absolve every inconsistency. But Ellie had the ledger. It wasn't a legal document, but it was damning. On one page, Jonah's first lost tooth, taped carefully with scotch tape beside a doodle. On another, the date Jonah had tied his shoes for the first time, marked with a triumphant star. And then, starkly different, a record of her findings. Altered report numbers, duplicate file entries, names she cross-referenced with missing signatures. Every page was a juxtaposition, motherhood beside investigation, innocence beside deceit. When her lawyer laid the ledger before the jury, the courtroom leaned in. Here was something no affidavit could mimic. The steady, stubborn handwriting of a mother who refused to let details be erased. The testimony began to unravel the city's carefully maintained facade. A clerk, pale and trembling, admitted through tears that she'd been ordered to replace an evidence envelope with a mislabeled one. A patrolman, sweating under cross-examination, slipped and admitted the dashboard camera had not been in maintenance as reported, but was off by direction. Each admission was small, almost trivial in isolation, but together they formed a chorus of complicity. The courtroom buzzed with the realization this wasn't a single error, it was a pattern, a culture of concealment. And then came the DNA results. The courtroom stilled when the judge announced them. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, though his voice remained measured. The boy was not Jonah. The test didn't hedge, didn't leave room for interpretation. Neutral, clinical, devastating. Ellie closed her eyes, and for a moment the silence seemed to collapse inward, crushing. For weeks, the defense had asked the town to trust appearances, the boy's smile, his laugh, his uncanny resemblance. But science had stripped the illusion bare. The boy was someone else. Reactions fractured the room. Some gasped, some wept. A woman in the gallery whispered, "Then where's Jonah?" And the question rippled outward like a stone hitting water. The defense scrambled, pivoting from denial to damage control. Mistakes were made, they said, but mistakes are not crimes. They pleaded the city had acted in good faith, trying to protect a vulnerable child while also responding to public panic. But good faith looked thin when weighed against redacted logs and sworn orders of silence. The trial didn't end with a neat ribbon of justice. It ended with jagged edges. There were resignations, some officials stepping down with shaky apologies, others clinging to scripted statements. A few indictments followed, though none against the highest officials. One senior administrator declared his actions were taken out of duty to preserve stability, words that landed like ash in the town's mouth. The journalist's steady reporting became the spine of the public record. Each article dissected not only the city's actions, but the moral question at the heart of it all. Was the comfort of a town worth the sacrifice of one child's truth? Ellie didn't find Jonah in that courtroom. She left with her ledger, heavier than ever, her grief sharpened into something colder than despair: resolve. The town of Meridian Hollow, once a place of routines and porch lights, now saw itself differently. It had been willing to accept a lie if it meant avoiding chaos. And that knowledge lingered like a shadow no resignation could erase. Ellie walked out into the press lights, her face tired but unbowed. The cameras wanted closure, but all she could offer was truth. "He's still out there," she said, her voice steady. "And I will not stop looking." And in that moment, it wasn't just a mother speaking. It was a mirror held to everyone listening. What would you have chosen, the lie or the fight for truth? The aftermath was not a single event. It was not a gavel striking wood, nor the sudden extinguishing of headlines. It was a slow, uneven unwinding, the way anesthesia fades, leaving you disoriented, aware that something has been rearranged in the room you thought you knew. Meridian Hollow had always relied on routine as its backbone, but now, routine carried new words. Words that had never belonged to this town before, now spoken in council chambers, PDA meetings, even at the diner counter. Accountability, oversight, reform. The municipal records office, Ellie's quiet workplace, was the first to change. Cameras were installed above every desk. A digital transparency portal launched with fanfare. What had once been stacks of forms in metal filing cabinets now lived in cloud servers accessible to the public. No more lost reports. No more redacted memos tucked into drawers. A family advocacy group formed, spearheaded not by Ellie. She had no desire to become a politician, but by other parents who had watched her fight. They named it Jonah's Light. Their mission wasn't to vilify police, but to make sure no mother would again have to pound on doors that should have opened willingly. The police department, embarrassed but cornered by public pressure, underwent retraining. New officers were taught not just procedure, but empathy, to remember that every missing child case was not paperwork, but a universe upended. For the first time in the town's history, outside auditors reviewed the department's conduct. Some people left Meridian Hollow altogether, unwilling to live inside a place that had been unmasked so publicly. Others stayed and marked their defiance in small ways, painting their porches a shade of blue that came to symbolize loyalty to truth. Driving through town, you could see it, a patchwork of blue porches, some freshly painted, others chipped, all signaling the same quiet allegiance. And yet, underneath all these changes, there was the bruise that never faded. Jonah was still gone. Ellie lived with that absence like a second shadow. Every reform meeting, every candlelit vigil, every whispered apology was a reminder of what she didn't have. The town could mend itself, could polish its conscience with committees and oversight, but she could not repaint the walls of her son's room and call it healing. The narrative does not tie itself into a bow. No ransom note discovered, no culprit dragged in chains through the courthouse, no miraculous reunion staged on courthouse steps. Life rarely behaves like fiction, and this story offered no exception. What it did offer were small restitutions. The police retrained. The town created a volunteer search ledger, a living document where neighbors could log sightings, security camera footage, even rumors, so that no lead would ever again vanish into silence. Every October, the town square filled with candles for the Remembrance Night, honoring children who had disappeared without trace. Jonah's name was always read first. Ellie herself discovered something unexpected. The lie, the substitution of another boy in Jonah's place, had revealed not just what a town could hide, but what it could learn. She had been a single voice against an institution's silence, and she had been heard. It wasn't the victory she wanted, but it was a victory nonetheless. True crime, when stripped of its headlines and sensational retellings, asks a quieter question. Not who did it or how did they do it, but what do we owe one another when fear collides with bureaucracy? In Meridian Hollow, One mother had refused to trade truth for calm. She refused the easy comfort of a substitute child. She forced her community into a mirror it had long avoided. The reflection wasn't flattering, but it was real. If you are listening now, let the last image in your mind be not of courtrooms or council meetings, but of something smaller. A swing in the yard, creaking on its chain, swaying back and forth in the October wind. The kind of swing Jonah once loved, the kind that carried laughter into the twilight. It slows. Stillness settles in. And around it, the town of Meridian Hollow begins, tentatively, carefully, to turn its lights back on. Porch by porch, house by house, not forgetting, not absolved, but awake.